In the final months of 1943, Luftwaffe bomber and reconnaissance units began to report something they could not explain. Allied anti-aircraft fire, once imprecise and predictable, had suddenly become terrifyingly accurate. Pilots returning from missions over France and Belgium described shells that detonated close enough to shred entire formations, yet with no visible hits. It seemed as though the shells were somehow aware of their targets. At first, command dismissed the reports as exaggeration or coincidence, but when bomber losses tripled in only a few weeks, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Something in the Allied arsenal had changed. On January 29, 1944, outside Antwerp, German engineers made a discovery that would confirm the pilots' fears. An unexploded American 90mm shell was found buried in soft ground near a railway line. The nose section was intact, the casing undamaged. It was quickly identified as an Allied anti-aircraft round, but unlike any the Germans had previously catalogued. The fuse assembly was sealed under an aluminum dome, smooth and featureless, with no mechanical timing dial or wind key. When Captain Erich Bohm of the Butwaffen Recovery Unit held it to his ear, he heard something faint, a low, metallic vibration, as though energy still pulsed within. He wrote in his field log, "The threads are perfectly machined. The metal is of unusual lightness. There is a hum, faint but alive." The shell and its mysterious fuse were sent to the Luftwaffe's Ordnance Analysis Center at Rechlin, under armed escort. There, a team led by Dr. Helmut Weiss, an engineer formerly attached to Telefunken's radar division, began the disassembly. X-ray imaging revealed a network of wires, glass cylinders, and a small copper coil. Weiss at first assumed it was some form of electrical timer, but as the outer casing was pried open, his team froze. Inside was a tiny sealed battery and 3 vacuum tubes the size of a child's finger. Miniature radio valves, mounted on shock absorbers, wrapped in resin, and wired to what appeared to be an antenna. Weiss dictated to his stenographer, "This is no timing mechanism. It is a transmitter. Gentlemen, the Americans have built a radar small enough to fit inside a shell." It was the first time German scientists had ever seen such miniaturization. Their own vacuum tubes, used in radar sets like Freya and Würzburg, were bulky and fragile, requiring constant maintenance and precise temperature control. Yet here, inside the head of a projectile designed to withstand 20,000 revolutions per minute and the crushing acceleration of gunfire, the Allies had placed a fully functional radio system. Weiss's team concluded that the device transmitted continuous low-power radio waves. When the shell approached an aircraft, reflected waves would disrupt the signal's phase, triggering detonation automatically at the right distance. The weapon was, in essence, a radar-guided brain. The implications were catastrophic. Traditional flak shells required timing fuses set by hand, based on altitude and speed estimates. Even the most accurate calculations rarely produced more than a 5% hit rate. But a fuse that could sense its target would raise that probability by hundreds of percent. Simulations by Luftwaffe analysts suggested that a defense network equipped with such fuses could wipe out bomber formations before they reached their targets. The only question left was whether Germany could make one of its own. The answer came quickly and painfully, no. The materials simply didn't exist. Their industry could not mass-produce such tiny, rugged vacuum tubes. Their glass and copper stocks were depleted, their factories strained. To build even a prototype would take years. The Americans, meanwhile, were already firing thousands of these shells every week. The discovery had a psychological effect beyond its technical shock. For the first time, German scientists felt they were looking not just at a new weapon, but at a different civilization's way of making war. This was not brilliance from one inventor, but a machine born of thousands of minds and millions of hands. A memo circulated within the Air Ministry quietly admitted, the enemy's strength lies not in invention, but in integration. Their laboratories are their factories. By February 1944, the Rechlin report reached Berlin. It was stamped Geheim, top secret, and marked for destruction after review. Major Friedrich Korte, who summarized the findings, wrote one final line in the margin, "The fuse we have recovered is not merely a device. It is a symbol of industrial perfection. What we have opened is not a shell, it is the future." The report was buried in archives, unseen until its declassification in 1956. Decades later, its tone still carried disbelief. Inside that small aluminum dome, the engineers of the Reich had found something that defied their science and mocked their faith in German precision. It was a weapon that listened, thought, and decided when to kill, all by itself. For those who examined it in 1944, it was not just another Allied invention. It was proof that the war, on a technological level, was already lost. For months, Luftwaffe intelligence officers had tried to verify the growing rumors about the mysterious Allied shells that seemed to explode without contact. Pilots called them ghost rounds, flak that could see. Intercepted Allied radio traffic mentioned a new fuse type labeled only VT. To German analysts, the initials meant nothing, but they appeared again and again in ammunition supply lists and naval shipments. The phrase was coded, and the meaning remained elusive. Then, in late January 1944, a string of coincidences changed everything. Allied gunners defending the port of Antwerp had fired hundreds of rounds from 90mm batteries during a night raid against German positions. One shell failed to detonate and buried itself deep in soft, frozen soil. When a railway maintenance team arrived the next morning, they saw a crater unlike the others, shallow, perfectly symmetrical, and faintly smoking. Inside it was an intact projectile, nose first, the brass casing gleaming under frost. A call was made to the local Flak Regiment 48 command post. Within hours, a Butwaffen recovery detachment was dispatched, led by Captain Erich Bohm. He was a meticulous man, a field engineer who had spent much of the war examining captured Soviet artillery. Nothing about this shell fit the usual patterns. It was unusually light for its size, the threading machined to microscopic precision, the metal strangely smooth and free of corrosion. There were no timing markings or mechanical settings, no adjustment levers, no fuse keyholes. It appeared to be sealed permanently, as though it had been built to conceal its function completely. Bohm's report described the moment they lifted it from the ground. It hummed faintly, he wrote. The vibration was subtle but constant, almost electrical. The men grew uneasy. We assumed it was unstable, perhaps magnetically triggered. I ordered the team to place it in a sand crate and maintain distance until transport arrived. The recovery truck, covered with tarpaulins, drove the shell south toward Brussels under nightfall, escorted by a pair of motorcycles. The driver later recalled that Bohm made them stop every 20 kilometers to listen. The hum persisted. The shell arrived at the Luftwaffe Technical Evaluation Depot near Ghent, where it was photographed, measured, and placed in an isolation chamber. Even there, technicians claimed to hear a faint ringing when the casing was touched with metal tools. At that stage, no one guessed the cause. The working theory was that it contained a new type of electric detonator, perhaps a British magnetic trigger adapted for anti-aircraft use. Only after initial X-ray images revealed delicate wiring and what looked like miniature vacuum tubes did higher command take notice. The discovery was deemed critical. On February 1, 1944, Field Marshal Erhard Milch authorized immediate transfer of the object to Berlin for expert analysis under the Reich Air Ministry's Science Division. The crate was labeled Captured Allied Fuse, experimental and guarded by military police throughout the 600-kilometer journey. When it arrived at the Rechlin test facility 2 days later, its escort list included technicians from Telefunken, AEG, and Siemens, all summoned without explanation. Dr. Helmut Weiss, the senior electronics consultant, would later write in his post-war memoirs that the crate had an aura about it, as if we knew we were about to open something from another world. Inside the laboratory, under dim lights, Weiss and his team approached the fuse with insulated tools. The outer casing came away easily, exposing a second sealed layer, a polished aluminum dome lined with a copper band. When they lifted it free, they saw for the first time the internal structure, a coiled antenna loop, 3 tiny glass tubes, a battery sealed in wax, and a circuit of wires finer than human hair. The room fell silent. One engineer whispered, "It's alive." They tested the components carefully. The tubes were still functional despite the shell's impact, their filaments unbroken. The battery, when probed, emitted a faint current. It was not just intact, it was operational. To the Germans, who struggled to keep radar equipment running inside reinforced trucks, the sight of such a fragile network surviving inside a high-velocity shell seemed impossible. A field report from Weiss's team summarized the shock succinctly. The Allies have succeeded in building a radio transmitter smaller than a cigar, rugged enough to survive gunfire. This is a new category of weapon. By the 3rd day of testing, the engineers had confirmed its principle. The device emitted a low-power radio signal. When the shell neared a reflective surface, such as an aircraft fuselage, the returning echo interfered with the signal phase, causing a relay to close and trigger detonation. The Americans had turned radar into a fuse. When Weiss sent his initial findings to Berlin, he added a short handwritten line at the bottom: "This cannot be reproduced under current German capability." The Air Ministry stamped the document geheim and ordered all further discussion restricted to the highest level. Meanwhile, Captain Bohm, who had personally recovered the shell, was called to Berlin to deliver his account. He never forgot what Weiss told him after showing the fuse under magnification. "You didn't just find a shell, Captain," he said quietly. "You found the future. And it doesn't belong to us." For the Reich's engineers, that realization was devastating. For the first time, they understood that the Allied advantage wasn't in any single invention, but in the unseen machinery of production that stood behind it. The proximity fuse was not a miracle of genius, it was a miracle of industry. And now, having opened it, the Germans knew they could never close that gap again. By the first week of February 1944, the captured shell had become the most guarded object in the Reich Air Ministry's custody. It was housed in a small underground laboratory at Rechlin, sealed behind 2 steel doors and watched by sentries instructed to shoot intruders on sight. Only 5 men had clearance to enter: Dr. Helmut Weiss, his deputy Ernst Kruger, 2 Telefunken electronics specialists, and an ordnance technician named Hans Kellner who was responsible for photographic documentation. No one else was permitted to touch the fuse. The order came directly from Berlin: "This specimen represents potentially decisive enemy technology. Treat with utmost secrecy." The dissection began on February 4th. The atmosphere in the lab was tense. The engineers worked under dim tungsten lamps, the smell of warm metal and solvent filling the air. They wore white coats and thick rubber gloves. On the table lay the aluminum fuse body, smaller than a clenched fist, still faintly resonant with static. Weiss recorded the first entry in the logbook: "Subject shows no corrosion. Battery appears sealed with resin. Internal cavity likely contains oscillator or timing circuit. Proceed with incremental exposure." They began by separating the upper dome. Beneath it was a wax-filled chamber cradling 3 glass vacuum tubes, each barely a centimeter wide and 3 centimeters long. They were held in a brass frame suspended on springs. The precision was breathtaking. Every connection was soldered with microscopic neatness, every wire secured with lacquer. Kellner took photographs using a Leica camera fitted with a macro lens, documenting the process frame by frame. What fascinated Weiss most were the tubes themselves. German radar equipment still relied on large, fragile valves, devices that shattered easily when transported. Yet here, the Allies had created components so tiny they could endure the brutal forces of cannon fire. Under magnification, Weiss noticed that the filaments were coiled tungsten wires encased in a shock-resistant mount. Each tube had its own serial number, suggesting mass production. The thought unsettled him deeply. "They are making these by the thousands," he murmured. "We still build ours by hand." Kruger carefully detached the copper antenna loop. It was astonishingly simple, a ring of fine wire wound around a ceramic core, but its geometry was precise, every millimeter calculated. Beneath it lay a small switch assembly connected to what appeared to be a resonant circuit. When energized, this coil would emit a continuous radio pulse. The fuse, in effect, was a tiny radar beacon, searching for its target in real time. The device required no external control, no manual adjustment. It sensed the world on its own. When the first internal diagram was completed, Weiss gathered his team around the workbench. He traced the wiring with a pencil and spoke softly. "The principle is familiar," he said, "but the scale, this is something else entirely. They have turned an entire radar transmitter into the size of a walnut. Gentlemen, this is science married to manufacturing." The team continued the autopsy late into the night, fueled by curiosity and growing unease. They discovered that the fuse's battery was magnesium-based, capable of producing current even after years of storage. It activated automatically under acceleration, completing the circuit the moment the shell left the barrel. There was even a safety delay, a simple mechanical interrupter that kept the fuse dormant until the shell had cleared the gun. Every part was engineered with obsessive foresight. Nothing was wasted, nothing ornamental. Weiss's notes from that night survived the war, later recovered from the archives of the Allied Combined Intelligence Committee. In one passage, written in pencil on yellowed paper, he confessed, we disassembled the device piece by piece and found no flaws. Each element was logical, efficient, and purposeful. There was no mystery in its operation, only in how they built it. To understand it was easy, to replicate it would be impossible. The following day, a courier arrived from Berlin carrying a message from the Air Ministry requesting a progress report. Weiss wrote back a single page marked, "Highly confidential." He explained that the device functioned as a proximity-triggered radio oscillator and estimated that Germany lacked at least a decade of industrial maturity to mass-produce similar equipment. He ended with one chilling line, "If this is standard Allied ordnance, the war in the air is already lost." When he sealed the envelope, he lingered for a moment over the open fuse parts arranged neatly on velvet trays. Each wire and circuit represented not just a weapon, but a worldview, a civilization that treated science not as a miracle but as a process. Weiss realized that even if Germany could copy the design, it would still fail, because the country that had built this fuse had also built the vast, invisible network of factories, workers, and engineers that made such miracles ordinary. That night, as he left the laboratory, Weiss paused by the door and looked back at the workbench. The disassembled pieces of the fuse glimmered faintly under the light, delicate and silent. "This," he whispered to Kruger, "is what defeat looks like, not on the battlefield, but under a microscope." The parts were catalogued, sealed in glass jars, and stored in a safe marked, Butwaf number 4762. Only a handful of people ever saw them again before the end of the war. When Allied troops captured Rechlin in 1945, the cabinet was empty. The fuse and its fragments had vanished, burned, buried, or taken away under orders that, to this day, no one has fully traced. When the engineers at Rechlin completed their dissection of the Allied fuse, what unsettled them most was not the principle behind it, but the scale. Every component was impossibly small, built with precision they could not duplicate. The fuse's inner world looked less like a weapon and more like a watchmaker's dream, a landscape of wire, glass, and copper measured in fractions of millimeters. In February 1944, Dr. Helmut Weiss compiled his detailed dimensional report for the Reich Air Ministry. He listed the tube measurements, filament gauges, insulation thickness, and soldering patterns. The smallest wire measured less than half the diameter of a human hair. The vacuum tubes, there were 3 in total, were unlike anything built in Germany. The team measured their internal vacuum at 10 atmospheres, a level of precision achieved only in the most advanced Allied laboratories. Each tube contained a coiled filament held by spring braces that allowed it to survive the shock of firing. The glass was so thin it was almost flexible, yet it resisted cracking even when dropped from a table. Weiss wrote in his notes, "It is a paradox of strength and delicacy, a machine that must endure the violence of war but is built like an instrument of peace." The German scientists immediately tried to trace its origins. Telefunken, Lorenz, and Siemens all maintained wartime contracts for radar and communications equipment. None of them had ever produced anything close to the fuse's components. Their smallest valves, used in the Liechtenstein radar sets, were roughly 5 times larger and shattered under impact. Attempts to create miniature versions in the past had failed because of impurities in German glass and uneven filament winding. Yet the American tubes were uniform, perfect, and clearly made in enormous quantities. In an internal memorandum to the Air Ministry, Weiss emphasized the industrial impossibility of what he was seeing. "Our problem is not one of intellect but of infrastructure. To reproduce this device, we would need not one laboratory but 1,000 factories operating at microscopic tolerances." He was right. Across the Atlantic, the proximity fuse was the product of a vast network, a partnership between the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, RCA, General Electric, and dozens of subcontractors working in total secrecy. Over 100,000 workers were involved, many of them women, assembling components so small they had to use magnifiers. Each valve was tested by automated shock machines designed to mimic the forces of artillery launch. Every failure was studied, corrected, and standardized. But to the Germans in 1944, none of this was visible. All they saw was the finished artifact, stripped of context, as alien to them as a piece of extraterrestrial technology. Engineer Ernst Kruger, Weiss's deputy, tried to estimate how the Americans could have built it. He concluded that they must have developed new manufacturing methods, microlathes, precision vacuum pumps, robotic coil winders. "They have industrialized the laboratory," he said in disbelief. The discovery led to a small crisis inside the Reich Scientific Command. Reports from Rechlin conflicted with the official ideology that German science was superior. The Air Ministry suppressed the document's circulation, labeling it technisch demoralisierend, technically demoralizing. Only a handful of officers saw the full report. Among them was General Erhard Milch, who had overseen much of the Luftwaffe's research. His handwritten comment at the bottom of the page read, "This is America's secret, the union of intellect and machinery." In an attempt to verify the findings, a team from the University of Göttingen conducted microscopic analysis of one of the fuse's broken tubes. They confirmed Weiss's measurements but found something else extraordinary. The cathode coating contained a barium-strontium oxide mixture that operated efficiently at low voltages, a design unknown in Germany at the time. It meant the fuse could run on a battery small enough to fit inside a projectile. Their own radar tubes required large, high-voltage supplies. Weiss summarized the discovery bluntly: "They have mastered electricity as if it were clockwork." The engineers considered the possibility that the device might be a one-off experimental model, but subsequent field reports disproved it. Dozens of identical fragments were recovered from flak sites across Europe. This was not a prototype. It was production-grade equipment. By March 1944, the mood at Rechlin had turned somber. The scientists continued their analysis with professional precision, but the tone of their notes changed. The language of confidence gave way to resignation. Phrases like "beyond current feasibility" and "unattainable tolerance" filled the pages. One entry from Kruger read simply, "We are measuring the difference between 2 centuries." At the end of that month, Weiss submitted his final evaluation to the Air Ministry. It consisted of only 3 paragraphs. The first described the operational principle. The second detailed the materials. The third contained a single sentence that stunned everyone who read it. "If the enemy can mass-produce devices of this sophistication, then technology, not manpower, not courage, will decide this war." The report was filed away under Geheimakt 4762. It never reached Hitler's desk. By then, German research budgets were collapsing, and the Reich was more concerned with surviving the Allied bombing campaign than understanding the science behind it. But for Weiss and his team, the proximity fuse marked a personal reckoning. In the quiet of their laboratory, surrounded by fragments of glass and copper, they had seen the future compressed into a cylinder the size of a child's toy. They had touched proof that the war had already moved beyond their reach, and that no amount of faith in German ingenuity could close that distance again. When Weiss sealed the last jar of recovered components, he whispered to Kruger, "It's not that we failed to invent this. It's that we could never have built it even if we had." When Allied forces began using proximity fuses in late 1943, the weapon appeared to the outside world as a simple improvement to anti-aircraft shells. What the Germans never truly grasped was that the fuse represented something much larger, the first wartime expression of industrial science as a collective weapon. Behind the fuse was not one inventor or laboratory, but an invisible army of factories, engineers, and scientists bound by secrecy, speed, and precision. By the time the first fuse was used in combat, more than 100 American companies had already contributed to its creation. The entire project had been classified under the codename VT, Variable Time. Its origins lay in 1940 at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, where a small group of physicists proposed the impossible, a miniature radar system that could fit into the nose of a shell and survive the brutal shock of firing. The military dismissed it at first. No electronic device had ever withstood such violence. But necessity overruled doubt. As Allied bombers suffered devastating losses over Europe, the project was revived, fueled by desperation and an almost limitless wartime budget. The key breakthrough came when engineers realized that the fuse didn't need to be perfect, it only needed to work once. Each shell was a one-time machine, a disposable computer that lived and died in milliseconds. That understanding changed everything. Production could prioritize speed and quantity over durability. The result was a manufacturing revolution. Factories in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio were retooled to produce millions of microscopic components that were once made only in university laboratories. For the first time in history, the assembly line met atomic precision. At RCA's Harrison plant, workers trained under magnifying lenses, winding copper wire thinner than a strand of hair around ceramic cores. Nearby, at General Electric's Schenectady facility, engineers built new vacuum systems capable of drawing the deepest vacuums ever achieved in mass production. Even the simplest task, sealing a tube with molten glass, required absolute precision. The workforce became part scientist, part artisan. But perhaps the greatest secret weapon was human, not mechanical. Much of the delicate work was done by women, the so-called fuse girls, whose steady hands and patience outperformed their male counterparts. They worked in clean rooms under strict security, never told what the devices actually did. One later recalled, "We thought we were making radio parts for ships. No one said these little bulbs were for shells." Each worker signed an oath of silence under the Espionage Act, punishable by prison. Not even their families knew. The project's scale was staggering. By 1944, more than 40 million proximity fuses had been manufactured. Entire supply chains were hidden behind innocuous labels. Boxes of components were marked radio altimeters or weather transmitters to obscure their purpose. Military couriers transported fuse parts in sealed convoys escorted by armed guards. Every batch was tested by firing them from specially reinforced guns. Those that survived and functioned perfectly were approved for mass loading. The secrecy was so complete that even Allied troops using the shells often didn't know how they worked. Artillery crews were instructed to handle them carefully and never attempt repairs. If a fuse failed, it was to be destroyed on the spot. The U.S. Navy even had standing orders to prevent recovery. Ships carrying proximity ammunition were to scuttle any dud rounds to the bottom of the sea rather than risk German capture. The fact that a single fuse survived intact and reached Rechlin was a rare accident of war, one that the Allies would have considered catastrophic had they known. In official records, the proximity fuses production network was later described as the most complex industrial coordination of the Second World War, surpassed only by the atomic bomb. The two projects even shared overlapping secrecy structures, both involved top universities, both relied on rapid prototyping, and both demonstrated that the new battlefield was as much in the laboratory as in the sky. Meanwhile, inside Germany, scientists like Weiss and Kruger could only imagine such an apparatus. Their own electronics industry was fragmented, constrained by shortages and competition between the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and the SS. Laboratories hoarded information, companies withheld patents, and every division pursued its own designs. Where the Allies had unity, the Germans had rivalry. The proximity fuse was proof of a civilization's organizational power. It was not the invention of one genius but the coordinated brilliance of thousands. Weiss, reading fragments of intercepted Allied technical manuals years later, remarked bitterly, "They have learned to build intelligence into objects, and we have not." After the war, when the Allied archives were opened, historians would discover how deep the secrecy went. The proximity fuse program had been classified, top secret, highest priority, its funding hidden within radar and communications budgets. Even President Roosevelt referred to it only as the new fuse. To the men at Rechlin, it had appeared as a mysterious artifact. In reality, it was the end result of an industrial system working at a level of precision no other nation had achieved. Decades later, when Dr. Weiss's recovered notes were examined by Allied historians, one line stood out among the technical jargon: "They have industrialized thought itself." That single sentence captured what the fuse truly represented, not a single miracle of war, but the moment when science became production, and production became intelligence. It was the line that divided the modern world from the one Germany was still fighting to preserve. When the first report on the Allied proximity fuse reached Berlin in March 1944, it was treated not merely as a discovery but as an alarm. The file was labeled, "Technological Emergency, Immediate Review." Within days, copies were circulated among select branches of the Reich Air Ministry, the Army Ordnance Office, and the Ministry of Armaments under Albert Speer. Each recipient was ordered to return the document after reading. No photocopies or transcriptions were permitted. The fuse, they were told, represented a potential collapse in Germany's air defense advantage, a threat that could alter the balance of the entire war. Speer understood the implications instantly. In his diary, he later recalled the meeting where the issue was presented. "It was the first time," he wrote, "that I felt a weapon had outpaced our entire industrial system." He ordered the immediate formation of a technical task group to study potential countermeasures and reproduction. The project was given the internal code name, Spurball, Barrier Device. At the heart of the effort were the same scientists who had examined the captured fuse at Rechlin, Dr. Helmut Weiss, his deputy Ernst Kruger, and several engineers from Telefunken and Siemens. Their new mandate was straightforward but impossible: duplicate the American design using German materials under wartime shortages in 6 months or less. The team began by drafting schematics based on their dissection notes. They quickly ran into the first obstacle: vacuum tubes. The tiny American radio valves were miracles of manufacturing, mass-produced by the millions, each identical to the next. German equivalents were handmade, inconsistent, and fragile. When the engineers attempted to build smaller versions, the filaments collapsed during the first shock test. Weiss recorded in his notes, "We cannot miniaturize our imperfection." The glass used in the American tubes was also beyond reach. German glassmakers at Schott AG attempted to replicate its thin, flexible structure but failed repeatedly. Even if they had succeeded, they lacked the machinery to form thousands of identical microenvelopes per day. The war economy simply couldn't sustain such delicacy. Every resource, copper, tungsten, even mica, was being consumed by radar systems and V-2 rocket production. The fuse project had to compete against weapons already in service. As their frustration grew, the Rechlin group tried a different approach, to design a simplified German version. Instead of radar-based proximity detection, they proposed a photoelectric trigger that would respond to changes in light when passing near a target. It was crude but theoretically feasible. However, early field tests failed disastrously. The circuits were too sensitive to sunlight, too fragile under acceleration, and too inconsistent to mass produce. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's high command pressed for results. Flak divisions across the Reich were suffering catastrophic losses. American and British bombers continued to devastate Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin with impunity. The skies burned nightly, and each new air raid made the fuse project seem less like an opportunity and more like a last hope. By late spring 1944, morale among the engineers collapsed. Weiss's diary, later recovered by Allied forces, contains an entry from May 12. "We work with broken glass and wishful thinking. Our enemy does not fear invention, he manufactures it. What takes us a year to design, they produce by the trainload." Speer himself visited Rechlin in June to assess the situation. Weiss and Kruger presented their findings honestly. They demonstrated the size of their best prototype, nearly the size of a coffee mug, and explained that it could not withstand gunfire. Speer asked quietly how long it would take to perfect the design. Weiss hesitated before answering, "Perhaps 10 years, under peace." The minister nodded, said nothing more, and ordered the program halted. Within a week, Spurball was shelved indefinitely. Its few surviving prototypes were boxed and shipped to a storage depot near Magdeburg. None of them would ever be fired. Still, not all of the Reich's leadership accepted defeat. In a classified memo dated July 1944, an SS technical unit under Hans Kammler proposed taking control of the research. They claimed that the fuse might be used in V-2 warheads, triggered by radar reflection near London. Weiss refused to cooperate. To put this device in a rocket, he told Kruger, would be to mock the very science that created it. The SS seized the Rechlin lab 2 weeks later, confiscating all notes and equipment. Weiss and Kruger were reassigned to unrelated radar projects and ordered not to speak of their work again. The research was effectively dead. When Allied forces later examined captured German documents, they found only fragments of the original fuse analysis. Many pages were burned, others redacted. What survived painted a picture of desperate innovation under impossible conditions, a race not against the enemy, but against the limits of an entire nation's capacity. Weiss's final surviving note on the subject, dated July 1944, summed up the tragedy of the German response with quiet resignation. "We were not defeated by the fuse itself, but by what it revealed, that technology belongs to those who can afford patience, precision, and collaboration. We had none of these left." By the time he wrote those words, the Allies were already fitting proximity fuses to naval shells in the Pacific, and the first German city had been burned almost entirely to ash. The war had become not just a contest of armies, but a measurement of civilizations, one that Germany could no longer win. By mid-1944, the fuse that German engineers had dissected in secrecy was rewriting the air war above Europe. What began as an obscure Allied experiment had become the most consequential technological advantage since the invention of radar itself. To the Luftwaffe pilots who once ruled the skies, it was invisible, unstoppable, and everywhere. The first large-scale deployment of the proximity fuse came during the winter of 1943-44, in the defense of London and the Mediterranean shipping routes. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, the fuse had matured into a mass-produced weapon, compatible with nearly every major Allied artillery system. The U.S. Navy had already used it to deadly effect in the Pacific, where Japanese dive bombers disintegrated midair under the sudden, precise bursts of smart anti-aircraft fire. Now, that same precision had arrived in Europe. For months, Allied flak had been considered largely psychological, noisy but unreliable. Pilots often joked that the only safe place during a barrage was directly inside the black puffs of smoke. But by the summer of 1944, those jokes stopped. The shells were no longer random. They exploded with uncanny accuracy, detonating just close enough to fill the air with shrapnel at perfect density. Bomber crews reported that their aircraft were being hit, without ever being seen. The difference was the VT fuse. From June to August, as the Allies advanced across France, proximity-fused shells protected bridges, convoys, and supply depots from Luftwaffe air attacks. One after-action report from the U.S. 7th Army noted that German dive bombers attempting to strike Allied columns near St. Lo were destroyed, in patterns suggesting self-aiming fire. Out of 20 aircraft, 16 were shot down within seconds. Commanders initially believed this was coincidence, until British gunners confirmed the presence of the new fuses. At the same time, the German High Command, unaware of the scale of Allied deployment, was still struggling to reproduce a single working prototype. While Dr. Weiss's abandoned Spurball project gathered dust, American factories were producing over 100,000 proximity fuses a day. The sheer volume allowed Allied forces to treat the device as expendable, a technological edge so common it no longer needed to be guarded. By autumn, the skies above Europe were different. The Luftwaffe's dwindling bomber formations suffered catastrophic losses whenever they approached Allied front lines. The flak now reached further, reacted faster, and struck harder. In the words of one German pilot captured near Aachen, it felt as though the shells could see me. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. Luftwaffe morale, already brittle from fuel shortages and relentless bombing, began to collapse. Reports from interrogation centers described pilots refusing missions over Allied-held territory, claiming it was suicide. One even said, "Our aircraft die before the enemy even aims." For Allied gunners, the change was immediate and visible. A single anti-aircraft battery, once lucky to down one plane per barrage, could now destroy half a squadron. The fuse's efficiency was so overwhelming that American officers were ordered not to mention it in correspondence or after-action reports. The fear of German recovery still lingered, even though the Reich's ability to replicate it had long since vanished. The real test came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. As German forces launched their final offensive through the Ardennes, the skies were choked with snow and low cloud, ideal conditions for Luftwaffe raids. Traditional flak would have been blind. But proximity-fused shells, operating by reflected radio waves, didn't need visibility. The result was devastating. Entire formations of German aircraft were blown apart in storms of timed airbursts. American troops on the ground later described the spectacle as fireworks in fog. A report from the U.S. 9th Army estimated that the VT fuse increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by as much as 400%. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by shortages and attrition, never recovered. By early 1945, the once dominant German Air Force was effectively grounded. Its pilots were ghosts in a sky they no longer controlled. Even the German scientists who had examined the captured fuse began to grasp the full extent of its use. Weiss, reassigned to radar calibration duty near Dresden, heard radio broadcasts describing the Allied breakthrough in the Ardennes. He later wrote in a private notebook, "It was their fuse that turned the air itself against us." By the time Allied troops crossed the Rhine in March 1945, proximity fuses were used in nearly every field gun, naval cannon, and anti-aircraft battery in the Allied arsenal. For the first time in history, artillery shells could sense their environment. The battlefield had evolved from mechanical to electronic warfare, and the Germans, who had once pioneered science for war, were now watching their own sky darken under a weapon they could neither see nor comprehend. To those who fought beneath it, the proximity fuse was both miracle and omen, proof that the future of warfare would no longer belong to those with the most men or the strongest will, but to those who could command electrons. And in that invisible realm, the Reich had already lost. When the war finally turned irreversibly in the Allies' favor, the generals credited tanks, bombers, and courage. But within the restricted circles of scientists and intelligence officers, another story was whispered, one that never made the headlines. The proximity fuse, a device smaller than a cigar, had quietly redrawn the boundaries of modern warfare. It was, in every sense, a silent revolution. In the years leading up to 1945, the world had been obsessed with power. Faster engines, thicker armor, higher caliber guns. The fuse introduced something else entirely, intelligence. It transformed the act of destruction into an act of calculation. It didn't need human reflexes, radar guidance, or command input. It decided when to kill, using logic embedded in copper and glass. The idea that a weapon could think, even in such a primitive way, unsettled the few who truly understood it. After the liberation of France, captured German engineers began to encounter the effects of the fuse firsthand. Interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence reveal a consistent reaction: disbelief. When asked about the American self-detonating shells, one former Luftwaffe colonel reportedly told his captors, that was not a weapon. That was witchcraft disguised as machinery. Others, like Dr. Helmut Weiss, now in custody under Operation Paperclip Review, spoke with a rather than resentment. We were still building engines, he told interrogators in May 1945, while they were already building ideas. By then, the proximity fuse had evolved beyond its original role. It was being adapted for ground artillery, allowing shells to detonate above enemy troops instead of burying themselves harmlessly in the mud. Soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge called them air bursts, invisible predators that shredded infantry formations with terrifying precision. The fuse's internal radar could detect the ground's reflection as easily as an aircraft's, turning every shell into an intelligent bomb. Its success did not go unnoticed. In January 1945, a restricted memorandum circulated among Allied research directors, stamped "Secret, Future Applications." It proposed adapting the same technology for guided missiles, torpedoes, and even experimental jet weapons. The authors argued that, if proximity detonation can be trusted, then guidance itself becomes the next logical step. That sentence, written quietly in a wartime report, was the seed of the modern smart weapon. Meanwhile, the Germans, stripped of their industry and defeated in the air, could only observe. When Allied forces occupied Rechlin, they found Weiss's laboratory empty, the fuse fragments carefully destroyed before capture. Still, among the papers that remained, one note stood out. It read, "The Americans have achieved in electronics what we once dreamed of in metallurgy, perfection at scale." In Washington, the success of the fuse created both triumph and paranoia. The device's existence had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. For 3 years, its distribution had been restricted even among Allied nations. Only after the Normandy invasion did British officers gain full technical access. Now, as peace approached, officials feared that its principles would spread unchecked. The word proximity became classified, and public references were replaced with phrases like radio-timed ordnance. The scientists who had built it knew what it meant. The fuse had proven that electronic control could be mass-produced, that intelligence could exist not in a person, but in a process. The transition from mechanical to electronic thinking had begun, quietly and irrevocably. What radar had done for detection, the fuse had done for decision. Decades later, historians would call it the dawn of the digital battlefield. But in 1945, it was still wrapped in secrecy and guilt. Some of its creators, like Dr. Merle Tuve of Johns Hopkins, struggled with the moral implications. Tuve once told a colleague, "We invented a machine that removes hesitation from killing. It thinks faster than we do." His words were never published, but they echo through every weapon that followed. As the Allies divided the spoils of war, the proximity fuse became a template for future technology. Soviet scientists captured examples in Eastern Europe and immediately began reverse engineering them. The United States, now aware of its strategic lead, ordered the continuation of the program under new names, VTMK-53, T-50A, and later, proximity detonators for missiles and nuclear weapons. The logic circuits born in those glass tubes would evolve, step by step, into the transistors of the 1950s and the microchips of the 1960s. The fuse had been a weapon, but it was also an origin story, the moment when machines began to make their own decisions. It was the bridge between the industrial age and the electronic age, built out of necessity and secrecy, in a world too chaotic to realize what it was creating. In the ruins of Berlin, As Allied engineers examined the remains of the Reich's research labs, one British officer reportedly found a copy of Weiss's translated report. Scrawled in the margin, in English, was a simple annotation: they lost because they could not miniaturize their genius. That, perhaps, was the truest lesson of the proximity fuse. It was not just a triumph of physics, but a philosophy, proof that intelligence, once confined to the human mind, could be transferred into circuits, and that wars of the future would no longer be fought by men alone. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war's secrets began changing hands almost as quickly as its cities. Laboratories were emptied, vaults cracked open, files stamped, Geheim scattered in corridors lit by Allied flashlights. In the chaos, both victors and vanquished were searching for the same thing: knowledge. And among all the discoveries of Hitler's crumbling empire, none carried the same quiet weight as the notes from Rechlin describing a single captured Allied fuse. American intelligence officers knew exactly what they were looking for. Under Operation Alsos, teams of scientists followed advancing armies to seize German research in physics, radar, and electronics before the Soviets could. When they reached Rechlin in late April, the airfield was already burning. Most of the archives had been deliberately destroyed. What survived was fragmentary, charred pages, faded photographs, and a small envelope containing sketches of a dissected proximity fuse. On the back of one photo, in faint pencil, was written, "It listens before it kills." The Allies quickly realized that the Germans had not succeeded in replicating the technology. Their radar development had been advanced. Freya, Würzburg, and Liechtenstein were remarkable systems, but they had remained instruments of detection, not automation. The proximity fuse had represented a different level of thinking, an electronic reflex. To the scientists of the Reich, that concept had been alien. Among the captured personnel was Dr. Helmut Weiss, detained near Dresden and interrogated by U.S. Army intelligence at Heidelberg in June 1945. The declassified transcript of his interview, found decades later, reads like the confession of a man who had glimpsed the future and been crushed by it. "We tried to rebuild it," Weiss said, "but we lacked the world behind it. The Americans have an empire of factories. We have only laboratories." When asked if Germany had ever come close to reproducing the device, he smiled faintly and replied, "Not even to understanding what it meant." He was eventually transferred to the United States under Operation Paperclip, assigned to assist in radar research at Wright Field. His expertise was valuable, but his morale was broken. In his private correspondence, he often wrote of the captured fuse as if it were an object of worship, a relic of a civilization that had surpassed his own. The fuse was more than a weapon, he told one colleague in 1946. It was proof that science had replaced strategy. Meanwhile, the Soviets were moving just as swiftly. Red Army technical officers, aided by German engineers left behind in the occupation zones, recovered remnants of the same Rechlin research. By the summer of 1946, Soviet laboratories in Moscow had successfully reconstructed several versions of the American proximity fuse using captured shells. Their progress alarmed the West. The fuse had gone from being a battlefield secret to the foundation of a new kind of warfare, one that would soon include missiles, guided bombs, and atomic triggers. In Washington, the fuse's success became a symbol of American scientific supremacy. Reports presented to Congress in 1946 described it as the second greatest secret of the war, exceeded only by the atomic bomb. It had cost over $1 billion to develop and manufacture, a staggering sum, but one that had saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. The public never knew the full story. Newspapers called it simply a radio fuse. The real name, proximity, remained classified until 1948. Yet even as the Allies celebrated, a new unease began to surface among scientists who had worked on the project. They understood that the fuse was not merely a technological breakthrough, but a philosophical one. It had removed the soldier's judgment from the moment of killing. Decisions were now being made by circuits, not men. The fuse's radar brain sensed, calculated, and acted in fractions of a second, far faster than any human could. That logic, once confined to artillery shells, was already being adapted for the next generation of weapons. By 1947, the same principle guided the development of radar-controlled anti-aircraft missiles and early computer targeting systems. Engineers who once built fuses were now building prototypes for self-guiding bombs. The line between science and conscience grew thinner with every design. In one private memorandum, Dr. Merle Tuve, the physicist who had overseen the original VT project, wrote, "We have created the habit of delegating intent. The fuse is only the beginning." For Helmut Weiss, the realization came too late. Living in quiet exile in New Mexico, he wrote his final reflection in 1949, a short note that ended up preserved in an Air Force archive. "We opened an American fuse and found a mirror. What we saw was our own defeat, measured in millimeters." The aftermath of the proximity fuse was not measured in battles won or lost, but in the transformation it unleashed. It had proved that intelligence could exist in machinery, that precision could be manufactured, and that the future of warfare would belong to nations capable of combining science with scale. It was a quiet revolution, one that began with a single unexploded shell in a Belgian field and ended with a new world built on silicon, signal, and fear. The proximity fuse was more than a wartime invention, it was the moment humanity crossed an invisible threshold. It marked the first time machines were given the power to decide, to sense, to act, and to kill, without human guidance. From its circuitry flowed the lineage of every guided missile, every smart bomb, every autonomous weapon that would follow. Captured German scientists, once convinced of their nation's technological supremacy, described the fuse not as a device but as a philosophy, a symbol of a civilization that had learned to merge science with scale. In that quiet synthesis, the Allies discovered victory. Today, fragments of those early fuses rest in museum cases, their copper tarnished, their glass clouded. Few who see them understand that they are looking at the dawn of electronic intelligence. From a buried shell in a Belgian field came the blueprint of the modern world, a world where precision replaced courage, and calculation replaced command. Final note, 1952. The fuse that once listened for aircraft now listens for everything. It was not the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new age.